David, are you there?
Hey, John, I'm here.
And where exactly are you? David Chalmers, by the way, is who I'm talking to. Where are you, David?
I'm at my home in Canberra, Australia.
And tell the viewers of Blogging Heads TV who you are.
Okay, I'm a philosopher at the Australian National University. I run a Centre for Consciousness here, and I'm in a philosophy program in the research school here. And I'm especially interested in consciousness, in philosophy, and in science.
Now, you had a background in, as I recall, mathematics or physics, or you didn't start as a pure philosopher. Is that right?
That's right. I started out in mathematics as a undergraduate student. Even got partway through a PhD in mathematics. I was always kind of interested in the problems of the mind and consciousness. It always seemed to me that these were the hardest unsolved problems in science. And it struck me that it would have been awfully cool to be a mathematician or a physicist 400 or 500 years ago when these areas were totally wide open and unknown. And whereas the mathematics and physics of today is gradually getting sort of filled in, we're filling in holes and so on. But the level of wide openness and excitement isn't quite there, I think, in the way it was sometime in the past.
So you were actually attracted to philosophy of mind from the beginning because you saw it as a hard problem.
I would say I was attracted to the problem of consciousness from the beginning because that struck me as, maybe the most interesting or one of the most interesting unsolved problems in science. And the way I ended up coming at it was through the philosophy of mind, because that was a way, at least for me, to get a sort of a grip on the picture, on the subject, and to find some way to get the big picture of the subject. But you can come at the problem from other directions, from psychology, from neuroscience, and so on.
Now you you got your PhD when, in the 1980s?
Yeah, actually, 1993. I went to Indiana, where I worked with Doug Hofstadter, the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach, and some other books like this, whose books I'd read as a kid. I guess he was your little temporal colleague at Scientific American.
He preceded me. He preceded me, but his legend certainly lived on while I was there. So yes. You actually were getting your PhD just when consciousness was becoming one of the central issues in science and was starting to attract the attention of lots of real heavyweights in neuroscience and other fields.
Yeah, the timing was pretty good in that way. When I was working on my PhD, consciousness hadn't yet sort of become a hot topic. What was hot when I was a student was a lot of stuff and AI, artificial intelligence, neural networks, connectionism. And I did a little bit of that. Thought that was interesting, but I thought the really big, interesting question in this vicinity is the problem of consciousness, which had been unfashionable for quite a number of years. Just around that time, though, it started returning to attention through a number of different sources. I guess Francis Crick and Christoph Koch played a big role from neuroscience by saying now is the time for neuroscientists to return to this subject. Dan Dennett published his book Consciousness Explained around 91 or 92, and that brought a lot of people into the subject. So there was this groundswell of interest in the early 90s, I would say.
Yeah, I've always thought that that when Francis Crick started studying consciousness and saying it was a solvable problem, it was sort of like when Richard Nixon, who was this communist hater, finally went to China and tried to reinstate relations with China. So only this anti-communist could bring about this softening in relations with this communist country, and only the notoriously hard-nosed Francis Crick could make consciousness a legitimate scientific topic.
I think he helped make it, he helped make it a respectable thing that someone could do without. I mean, it's probably still the case that in some bits of neuroscience, you work on consciousness, there are going to be some people who roll their eyebrows and say, "Wow, isn't that a bit out there?" But it's been a subject that I think even a lot of people who work in the neurosciences, they get into the subject in the first place because they're interested in, not in the little questions about how cells function, but in the big question about how the mind works, what consciousness is. And then it's very easy for people to get diverted into the, the smaller, more tractable questions. At the same time, they maintain an interest in it. So what people like Crick did was to move the discussions of consciousness in neuroscience from the late night discussions over beer that everybody had to, okay, here are a few ways that we can think about studying this in the lab.
So, the first time that I met you was at this conference. It's now legendary. The first big, it called itself the first big conference on consciousness. I think it was called Toward a Theory of Consciousness, something like that, held in Tucson, Arizona in 1994. And it was this amazing conference with all sorts of people, from these real New Age flakes to big-time neuroscientists. Christoph Koch was there. Some very prominent philosophers were there. You were there. And as far as I could tell, that was when you first started getting attention for describing consciousness as the hard problem. So give me your recollections of that conference.
Yeah, that was a pretty amazing event. I guess people now talk about it as the Woodstock of consciousness studies. The first big event where everybody got together, and it was a crazy time, but incredibly exciting. I think it was organized by 3 or 4 guys at the University of Arizona who got together.
That's right.
Stuart Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist there, very interested in physics and consciousness. Al Kazniak, who's a psychologist working on emotion. Al Scott, who was a mathematician interested in nonlinear dynamics. And Jim Laukas, who was administrator, who brought everything together. And this was basically 4 guys in a garage, but they said, wouldn't it be cool to have a big conference on consciousness? They invited everybody, and almost everybody came. So it was a huge convergence of people. Actually, I think that first conference was maybe only 200 or 300 people, but that felt pretty big at the time. And I was just getting started out myself. I was a postdoc in St. Louis, had just written my dissertation on consciousness. I submitted a paper there, thinking, okay, I'll probably be in a poster session or something, but I thought it'd be nice to be there. And for whatever reason, the organizers said, okay, we need some philosophy. Maybe the philosophy will go in the first session. So I ended up giving a talk in the opening session of the conference, along with a couple of other philosophers. And I thought, okay, I'll just open with a couple of remarks to set the stage and say some obvious things. Here are the easy problems of consciousness, explaining aspects of behavior. Here's the hard problem. The hard problem is getting at subjective experience, something we'll talk about more in a second, I'm sure. And I thought, here I'm just setting the stage, saying something totally obvious, and then I went on to say some other stuff. I don't know if anyone remembers the other stuff, but this thing about the hard problem being the problem of subjective experience seemed to catch people's attention.
Well, I remember, I was in the audience for that talk, and I remember that there was a round of applause that was unusual for that conference, and my feeling was that you kind of cut through the bullshit in a way that most of the other speakers hadn't done. So other speakers were giving their theory of consciousness, and most of these theories were rather arcane even for me, and I'm a professional science journalist. I had already been talking to Francis Crick and Christoph Koch and Dan Dennett and some others, but still a lot of the theories were very dense and technical, and these philosophers and scientists were saying that they'd explain consciousness in terms of information theory or quantum mechanics or holograms or spirituality or something like that. And people were probably out there fairly baffled by most of these talks, and it didn't seem as though they were getting real solutions to consciousness. And you come up and say that you think we need a radically new approach, and you sort of frame the problem in a way that nobody else really had before.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to say that I framed it in a way that nobody had before. I think in a way...
Not nobody in history, just nobody at the conference, at least to that point. That's my recollection anyway.
Maybe that's right. But I think at the same time, the sort of thing I was saying there was the kind of thing that everybody there appreciated at some level already. We all most of the people at that conference got into studying consciousness because of what I'm calling the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of subjective experience. That's the big mystery. How is it that a physical system like a brain could support this, first-person perspective on the mind and on the world? Still, at the same time, when it comes to people developing actual theories of consciousness, there's this odd phenomena where they sort of lose their focus on that, and they end up giving an explanation of something else, some very sophisticated aspect of behavior, or language, or control, or report, or being awake versus being asleep. And then there's a feeling in the audience of, okay, this is all right, but this isn't quite getting at what we saw as the central mystery. So maybe this label, the hard problem, which I basically took to be articulating the obvious, was just provided a very convenient way to encapsulate that feeling that, okay, these other guys here are working on the interesting but easier problems of consciousness, not getting at the central mystery, the hard problem. But I think the reason it caught on was that feeling was very much in the air all along.
Right. Well, I actually, when I wrote about that conference in one of my books, I went back and tried to find some previous expressions of the hard problem, and there's some great ones that go back hundreds of years, and I'm sure you've run across. So here's one from Leibniz. This is late 17th century, and he wrote, "Suppose that there be a machine, the structure of which produces thinking, feeling, and perceiving. Imagine this machine enlarged but preserving the same proportions so that you could enter it as if it were a mill. This being supposed, you might visit it inside, but what would you observe there? Nothing but parts which push and move each other, and never anything that could explain perception." Now, to me, what I like about that is that it gets at what some people, I think you used this phrase in that talk you gave in Tucson, what some people call the explanatory gap. So you've got material things on this side, you've got neurons and neurotransmitters and the physical processes that take place in the brain, and then you've got subjective experience, which is really unlike anything else that science is trying to explain. So philosophers have been grappling with this problem really for centuries, or I guess even millennia. Maybe it goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers.
Actually, it's interesting that it's not as easy to find it among the ancient Greek philosophers as you would think. So this was my first reaction. You'd find, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle worrying about this problem, and there are bits and pieces that look, maybe sort of along the right lines, but it's interesting that it's not as prominent as you might think among the ancient Greeks. I think it took until around the time of, say, Descartes and Newton 400 or 500 years ago for the people to begin to really be to grapple with this problem. And the reason was, I think, that it was around that time that the materialistic picture of the universe, the picture of the universe as, just coming down to physical processes, started to catch on. Science was developing, and here we are with this picture of the universe as atoms in the void, just physical processes. And it's against the background of that picture that this hard problem of consciousness arises. How does consciousness fit into that? It's a manifest fact that we have these, experiences, sensations, perceptions, and so on of consciousness in our mind. How do you reconcile that with the scientific picture of the world? So, in a way, we really needed to have that scientific picture of the world in place first for the problem really to become vivid.
So, David, you not only framed the problem in this way that a lot of people found very sort of fresh and vivid, you also proposed a tentative solution to the hard problem. So can you tell us briefly what that solution is?
Well, there's different levels of thinking about the right way to theorize about consciousness. The first thing I tried to argue for after separating out these problems was to argue that any purely physical theory would never give you a full explanation of consciousness, basically because physical theory grounded in the interactions of neurons or computational processes in the brain will only ever explain these easier problems of behavior and control and functioning. Those will always leave a gap to the explanation of experience. And I tried to argue that that's not just a gap that's temporary, that arises right now because of the state of neuroscience, but that it's a principal gap that's going to arise for any neurobiological or any physical theory. So at this point, I mean, okay, so no physical, just say you accept that much. No physical theory is going to explain consciousness. Do we give up or do we go further? I mean, my attitude at this point was, okay, well, we've come up against this kind of situation previously elsewhere in science, where everything in our existing theories and indeed our existing ontology of what's in the world doesn't explain a phenomena. What do we do then? Well, we need to expand our theories, expand our ontology. So for Maxwell, giving a theory of electromagnetism, turned out he couldn't give it in the purely mechanical terms that descended from Newton. So he expanded the theory by bringing in, okay, charge as a fundamental entity in the world, and new fundamental laws governing electromagnetism. So the first thought about consciousness that, for me, grows out of this explanatory gap between physical processes and consciousness is that we're in roughly that kind of situation that Maxwell was in. We need something new and fundamental in our theories, and the most straightforward that this could go in this circumstance is to take consciousness itself as a fundamental aspect of the world, in the same way that physics itself takes space and time and mass and charge as fundamental aspects of the world. And then we can investigate. Go on.
Well, you say consciousness. What I recall you saying wasn't that consciousness should be a fundamental property of the world, but information, which is a little bit more subtle, and I think most people would find a little bit more plausible, because there was a lot of discussion in the late 80s and early 90s about reformulating physics, for example, in terms of information theory. This is something that John Wheeler had been writing about. There was this guy named Ralph Landauer at IBM, a physicist, who wrote a famous essay called "Everything is Information."
In fact, our host Robert Wright has this fantastic book, Three Scientists and Their Gods, all about people coming at this idea of information as something really basic in the sciences. That I actually read when I was a PhD student. It was quite influential on me. He talked about Edward Fredkin, who has the view that the universe is a digital computer constructed out of information. I think E.O. Wilson was in there.
So you were a philosopher, sort of a philosopher/scientist, whose views were influenced by a mere science journalist.
I guess that's right. Yeah.
Well, good. That's
gives you guys hope.
I think that reflects well on my whole tribe.
Yeah, actually, like a lot of people growing up, I didn't read science articles. I didn't read Nature and Science. All the science I got was through science journalism. So, Isaac Asimov, he was another huge influence on me. So,
right.
That's where the seeds of a lot of ideas end up coming from. And Doug Hofstadter, well, he's not exactly a science journalist, but a lot of my thinking about the mind came from reading his books as a kid. But
yeah,
anyway,
that's interesting. Yeah, so go back to information and how, what are some of the consequences of assuming that information is a fundamental property of reality?
Okay. So, there's a few steps here. So one is the basic idea that we need to admit experience itself as a fundamental aspect of the world. But then the question is, okay, to say that much is not really to give any kind of theory. It's just to say, well, it's there. Then the thought is there have to be some fundamental principles that connect experience to fundamental aspects or to certain aspects of physical reality. That say where you have certain kinds of physical processes, you get certain kinds of experiences. Then the thought is, well, what form will those principles, those fundamental laws take? And here's where, for me, it gets quite. You might think this is already speculative, but here is where, at least back then, I put forward the speculation that maybe information could be playing a key role in understanding these principles that connect physical processes to experience. So there's already this idea floating around in the more theoretical parts of the physical sciences and so on, that maybe we can formulate laws of the universe in terms of information. Wheeler had.
What do you mean? Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you could define information. I think it means different things to different people. There are certain technical uses of it in information theory or even in thermodynamics. And what do you mean by information?
I always liked a slogan that came from Claude Shannon, which is information is a difference that makes a difference. So information basically comes down to bits, things which can be either one way or another. 0 or 1 is the way it's represented as being. And Shannon's theory of information was a theory of bits which might get sent down a communication channel and make a difference at the other end. But anything which is in a state which can be one way or another way and make a difference to other states, in principle, you'll find information there. And then, normally we think of information as being non-basic. You've got something underneath the information, something like a voltage or a electric circuit, and information is carried within it. But some people, and maybe Wheeler is a good example, have proposed inverting this way of thinking, that somehow information is the truly fundamental thing in the world is information, states which can just be one way or another, bits, that is, and everything in the world sort of emerges from that. So Wheeler calls this it from bit. We've got a fundamental informational level of the universe, which is basically like a structure of something like bits, and everything we see in the world is grounded in this fundamental level of information. I mean, I'm not sure the idea makes sense, but it's a beautiful, elegant idea.
Well, I always thought that John Wheeler. I interviewed him for Scientific American in the early '90s, and I think he was in his early '80s at that point, and he still had this amazing, imaginative, poetic mind. He was like the ultimate physics for poets professor, because he actually was capable of really rigorous, mathematically heavy physics, enough so to impress a lot of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. But he had this wild imagination, and he was always connecting very disparate parts of physics. He was the person who coined the term black holes and helped to explore black holes to the point where people started taking them seriously in the 1960s, when they had been considered sort of an embarrassment for physics. But anyway, going back to the concept of information, I have to get to the conscious thermostats, because that's always a problem I've had with your view of consciousness. So tell us how you were led to this consequence of your theory or your model.
Yeah. Okay. So once you've got this notion of information in the picture, and possibly information as fundamental in the picture coming from physics, then at least I was led to think, okay, maybe that could be a key to thinking about consciousness. That maybe there's information itself. Fundamental information has two aspects, sort of its physically embodied aspect and a conscious or a phenomenal aspect. So it's just a fundamental principle on this view of the world, that where there's information, or perhaps where there's certain kinds of information, it has these two sides, a physical side and a conscious side. So I mean, studying consciousness itself, it seems to have this informational structure. For example, colors. There can be one way, there can be another way. Consciousness itself embodies information. So here was a thought. I think back then it was just it still is, just a very speculative thought. Maybe the fundamental principles that link physical processes to what's in experience might involve this notion of information, and that we can have sort of laws connecting these two aspects of information. And now then, of course, once you've got that on the table, then the worry comes up immediately. Well, information is everywhere. There's basic information in a telephone wire. There's information in a thermostat. There's even information in an electron. An electron can be in certain states that make a difference. So, immediate question, does this mean that thermostats and telephone wires and electrons themselves have a little bit of consciousness? Now, there's two ways you could go here. One is to restrict the theory so that only certain kinds of information get to carry this other aspect and to carry consciousness. And you might think that's the more sane, conservative way to go. But the other way you can go, which is a speculative way to go, which I at least don't rule out, is the idea that all information processing goes along with a certain kind of consciousness. Complicated information processing, as in a human brain, gives you extraordinarily complex consciousness of the kind we have. But maybe very simple information processing of the kind you get in, say, a thermostat, give you some extremely simple kind of consciousness or proto-consciousness. And this is the point, I guess, at which you want to roll your eyes and say, that's just crazy.
It's not, I mean, you can sort of just dismiss it and go, oh, well, how can a thermostat be conscious, or I think you even suggested that rocks might be in some sense conscious. But I think it's it's, I'm trying to understand why I have that reaction, and I've actually thought about this quite a bit recently because there have been a couple of books. There's a book by Seth Lloyd, a physicist at MIT, that's come out within the last year or so on basically this information theory view of all physical reality. And the problem, this is similar to sort of an extension of John Wheeler's view of how information and physics can mesh somehow. The problem I have is that, this is sort of equating information with just physics. And to me, the concept of information only makes sense if there is an agent in the system that's capable of choice. So information is something that comes to some kind of conscious creature. Maybe it doesn't even have to be conscious, but it's some kind of organism or entity that's capable of choice. And based on this information that's coming in, and the information might have, the physics of it might be irrelevant. It's got this symbolic value that can have a profound impact on this entity, which can then go in very different trajectories as a result. So free will is in there somehow too. And the notion that a thermostat or a rock or the solar system, stars, and everything in the universe has free will or consciousness, even in some kind of rudimentary sense, it seems to me to expand the notion of information, and along with it consciousness and free will, so much that they become virtually meaningless. So then you go back to the other alternative, which you just mentioned, of somehow restricting the model so that you're not led to what I think are absurdities. And then I think you're sort of starting from square one.
Yeah, two questions, right? One is whether things like thermostats embody information, and two is whether it's plausible to think they have some kind of consciousness. I think the question about information is sort of there are multiple concepts of information floating around, and you've got to get clear on the distinction. So you think, well, to really have information, you've got to have understanding. You've got to have something like meaning, and that's why it requires this kind of complexity and choice and action. There is a way of using the word information so that it embodies that, so that it requires meaning and understanding and choice. But I think there is a more basic, or at least there is another concept of information, roughly Shannon's concept, where understanding, meaning, choice don't play a role in understanding what information is. It's information. Any pattern of bits gives you information, and that's just the concept of information which Shannon used and which I'm using here. Now, but I take it the deeper question which you're raising, though, is in the absence of understanding, choice, free will, all those things, why think there could be consciousness? So the thermostat, even I'm not going to argue that the thermostat has free will. I'm not going to argue that it's thinking, that it's understanding. Why think that it has consciousness? And here I think, you've got to distinguish lots of different kinds of consciousness. There's the kinds of complex consciousness we have through our thinking, through our acts of choice, through our decision-making, through our emotions, and so on. There's also some very simple aspects of consciousness, like our experience of color, red versus green versus blue, the feeling of pain, and so on. To me, these seem like much more primitive things that it's not obvious that the experience of color has anything much to do with free will or intelligence or emotion or these complicated things. They might make a difference around the edges. These seem to be primitive things. I don't see why simple visual experiences of color or feelings of pain couldn't be present even in very simple systems like, say, flies, insects, earthworms. And once you make that distinction between the very primitive, simple aspects of consciousness and the more complex, it no longer becomes obvious to me that those things couldn't be present in a very simple system like, say, a thermostat. I admit the idea is counterintuitive, but I don't, at least it doesn't seem to me to be ruled out by the evidence. One of the fundamental paradoxes of consciousness is that it's not something we can measure directly from the outside. The science of consciousness would be so much easier if we had the consciousness meter, which, you wave at someone's head, you go searching for consciousness, and it gives you a readout of their consciousness. But we can't do that. It's private. It's subjective. I can't know for sure that you're conscious. And, of course, the same thing applies to a fly. and even indeed to a thermostat. We don't see it. We can't see that it's conscious. We can't rule it out either.
See, this is why I think. So I'd like to define the different. Let me just actually throw a definition at you first, and then I'll go back to this other point I wanted to make. It seems to me that the difference between philosophy and science now is that science, at least in principle, addresses questions that sooner or later, given enough resources, can be answered once and for all. They can be resolved. I know that that's fairly controversial, and there are some philosophers who would dispute that, but that's a definition that works for me. Whereas philosophy, it seems to me, deals with that set of questions that cannot be, in principle, resolved. So the question with consciousness, it's the mind-body problem, which philosophers and lots of people have been wrestling with for a long period of time, is whether or not it's a philosophical problem or a scientific problem. The reason why I think it's a philosophical problem that will never be resolved in this kind of satisfactory way that, for example, the problem of heredity was solved in the 1950s and 1960s, is because of the problem that you just raised. It's sort of, I sometimes call it the solipsism problem. Our thoughts, our subjective world is completely private and sealed off from access by anybody else. I don't know you're conscious. You don't know I'm conscious. We assume so. We're sort of innately hardwired to assume that other humans and even other creatures are conscious. But when it comes to insects, worms, amoebas, my laptop computer here, robots, things like that, a theory of consciousness should be able to tell us which systems with particular physical qualities or a certain pattern or arrangement of the physical components of that system might be conscious. But because of this solipsism problem, we can never know whether any other entity is conscious. So the theories will always remain purely speculative.
Yeah, well, I'm not one myself for drawing a big demarcation between philosophy and science. I think these things are more or less continuous, but I think one can raise the problem you're raising independently of that. The question is, there are questions about consciousness here that may potentially never be resolvable because of the worries about measurement. You might think that to finally resolve these questions, we're going to need some empirical theory based in measurements and things we can demonstrate to be the case. We're never going to get that with consciousness because we don't have the consciousness meter, and therefore we'll never have a final theory. Now, I think one shouldn't underestimate these worries. Obviously, it's something that makes the theory of consciousness much harder and makes it a much more slippery problem to get a scientific grip on than other things that are straightforwardly measurable. But at the same time, I think it's not a choice between we're going to have a perfect scientific theory that's as well supported as, say, the theory of quantum mechanics, or we'll have nothing. There are things you can do which are in between, which involve a partial scientific grip on the problem as well as a philosophical grip. So one thing we do a lot in the science of consciousness, as well as in other areas of science, is to make certain assumptions. I mean, you're right. Okay, yeah. I can't prove that you're conscious. I can't prove that anybody else is conscious apart from me. By the same token, I can't prove there's an external world. Descartes had this problem. How do I know that I'm not the only being in the entire universe, and that there's actually not all this other stuff that it seems to be out me is just around me is just a parade of experiences in my mind. Now, what we normally do here is we just make certain assumptions. We think, well, it's reasonable to believe that our experiences are experiences as of an external reality. When I see a voltmeter, there's really a voltmeter there, unless there's some specific reason to believe otherwise. And without making that assumption, you don't even get physics off the ground.
Right.
So in the study of...
I was going to say, I thought at some point I definitely wanted to talk about the Matrix, because you wrote that really interesting essay about the Matrix. But before we get to that, I wonder if I could just ask you a question about whether your thinking has changed about the possibility of neuroscience making serious inroads on the problem of consciousness. And let me be a little more specific. Something I've been writing about recently and have been talking to a lot of people about, including Christoph Koch, is something called the neural code. So have you encountered that phrase before, neural code?
Which neural code are you talking about?
Well, it's kind of a general term, the way that Christoph and some others are using it to describe basically the software that runs in the brain. So you've got all these neurotransmitters transporting electrical pulses through the brain, and these are roughly analogous to bundles of electrons going through a digital computer. The question is, what is the pattern of these electrical signals in the brain that corresponds to memory, perception, emotion, and even subjective experience? So it's basically trying to come up with a code for the brain that is roughly analogous to the genetic code, which helped to solve the problem of heredity. Now, the people who are working on this assume that the neural code will be immensely more complicated than the genetic code. But some of them do think that this is a solvable problem, and that if we can crack the neural code, we might have much deeper insight into free will and the mind-body problem, and even mental illnesses like schizophrenia and so forth. So it's a way of sort of framing the goal of neuroscience that I find really compelling, and I think it could lead to practical consequences. I mean, the neural code, if you understand the neural code better, then you can design more effective interfaces with electronic devices, neuroprosthetics, and so forth. So it might have practical consequences, but it might also illuminate some of these old philosophical questions.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea. That, I mean, it goes back to an old idea in philosophy, which is there's a language of thought. You know, there's some basic primitive system of symbols in the brain in which we do our thinking, in which we do our perceiving, and so on. And this is an implementation of that idea down at the level of neurons. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical that the difference between perception, memory, learning, emotion is going to be found, and indeed consciousness, is going to be found in something as simple, some localizable property of, say, neural firings. I've had this debate with Christoph Koch. I think about 10 years ago we made a bet that within 25 years someone's going to find some very simple intrinsic property of neurons that is at least the neural correlate of consciousness. Some simple property of a neuron, like a spiking frequency or a particular pattern of firing, such that that is the pattern for consciousness. That's one possible way things could go. I mean, of course, the first thing I'd say about this is when it comes to consciousness, this is going to be a story about the neural correlates of consciousness. And I mean, this gets back to the question you asked a second ago. Can neuroscience make inroads on the problem? I think neuroscience is making a lot of inroads on developing a theory of consciousness, mostly through this project of correlation, finding the kinds of neural firings in the brain that go along with states, with different kinds of states of consciousness. You know, when you see, when you hear, what's the difference between seeing consciously, which we do most of the time, and seeing unconsciously, which it turns out some people can do some of the time. So there's a project of finding neural correlates of consciousness, which I think is really crucial to building a theory of consciousness. It's not going to solve the hard problem on its own. I mean, I think any amount of neuroscience here is still going to be a story about processing in the brain, the structure, the function it produces, the behavior it produces. There's always going to be the further question. Why should all that be accompanied by subjective experience rather than going on sort of in the dark without consciousness? And as far as I know, nobody who's thinking about the neural code is at this point thinking that it's going to solve that problem. But one of the things that has come out of thinking about the science of consciousness in the last 10, 15 years has been you don't need to solve the hard problem of consciousness to make some pretty strong scientific progress on developing a theory of consciousness. And I think of the neuroscience of consciousness for the last 10 years as doing just that.
That's right. Well, maybe now we could bring back the Matrix. The Matrix actually helped me start thinking more about the neural code because Here, it's the classic brain in a vat scenario, except that it's actually a whole person in the vat. So we find out that Neo thinks he's living in a reality very much like ours, and it turns out that he's stuck in this big beaker, and he's got wires coming out of his head, and the wires are feeding signals into his brain that create this illusion that he mistakes for reality, and that meant that these evil machines that have stuck him in that big beaker have basically solved the neural code, because you have to solve the neural code to manipulate people's cognition in that kind of complete, really compelling way. What I always thought was a problem with the movie is that the evil machines were smart enough to solve the neural code and take advantage of it in this really diabolical way, but they weren't clever enough to come up with a better energy source than sticking humans in beakers. Because if you remember in the movie, the reason that the machine stuck all these humans in the beakers was because it provided energy for the machines.
Yeah, in contradiction with all known laws of thermodynamics. This was a little bit bizarre to figure out how the hell is this working. Now, why, though, do you say they needed to solve the neural code to do this? I mean, you might think there's a simpler thing that the machines could do. Just leave the brain to its own devices, feed the brain the kind of inputs that it would get from a world like this one, and monitor its outputs. So I'll send it, inputs from my simulated reality, let the brain do its processing however it does it, and sort of monitor the motor neurons and so on to see when it produces some action. Then whatever the motor neurons do, that when they fire in a way that would normally move the arm, let's just make sure that back in the simulation, the simulated arm moves in exactly that way. Wouldn't that be enough for the machines to set up the matrix without solving the neural code?
Well, it's possible. That's interesting. I guess it's possible if they could have set it up in such a way that the brain's own powers of imagination would take over and the brain's own sort of plasticity. But the way that I thought it was set up sort of in a technical sense is that they are feeding this complete world down to every tiny little detail into these humans' brains, and to do that you would have to have this incredibly intricate knowledge of the precise sequence of pulses that you'd need to stimulate neurons responsible for perception and memory and so forth. And we aren't even close to doing that, because of course, remember, it was a shared illusion. So different people in different beakers supposedly were living in the same matrix. And then the evil machines could manipulate it in very precise ways, sending in, Agent Smith and all his different permutations and so forth. So one way or another, that indicated to me that you're talking about an extremely high level of micro-manipulation of the inputs into the brain.
I guess I was thinking that you have one common simulation of the world. The matrix is a simulation of the external world, and the common illusion is going to be explained by the fact that all of these separate brains in their vats are getting input from this common computer simulation.
Yes, but still, you have to feed that into the brain somehow.
But at the sensory interface to the brain, you've got to sort of stimulate the optic nerve, so to speak, in these vats. Now,
right now we've got, for example, there are optical prostheses, and you can stick electrodes into the visual cortex and connect them to an external camera, and people might see a few pinpoints of light, but it's very crude. And the idea of creating a full-fledged reality with all these details that's absolutely compelling is just so far beyond what we're capable of now that it's a question of whether that will ever be possible. And the people who are working on the neural code now, some of them think that we will never reach that level of detailed knowledge of the neural code or ability to manipulate it. But that's why the movie is such a wonderful sci-fi, or nevertheless, the movie is still a wonderful exploration of those possibilities.
There's also a really interesting question that comes up when you think about the Matrix, which is inside that simulated physical world of the Matrix, we simulate bodies, we simulate, trees. They also simulate brains. So there's a simulated brain inside the body of the simulated Neo in the Matrix, and there's also a real brain out there in the real world. And then the question, how do those two things relate to each other? The simulated brain and the real brain. So I guess following up on what you said, one way this could work in the Matrix is somehow through their understanding of the neural code, they make sure that the simulated brain inside the Matrix and the real brain in the real world are always perfect counterparts of each other. And that's how they never get out of sync with each other. This would actually, if you're right about, if this idea is right, this would actually explain one somewhat mysterious thing about the movie, which is why is it that when you die in the Matrix, when you die in the Matrix, you die in the real world too? That always seemed bizarre. Wouldn't the vat be protected from death in the Matrix? But if there are mechanisms set up so that the simulated brain and the real brain are always perfect copies of each other, and the moment there's brain death, I presume, in the Matrix brain, that is simulated brain death, there's going to have to be real brain death in the vat brain as well, and that's why when you die in the Matrix, you die in the real world.
Well, I thought that the movie was, there are certain things where I just was willing to suspend disbelief and not go into the technical plausibility too much. But another of the issues that you took up in your piece that is really sort of has been part of the zeitgeist lately is the idea of the simulacrum, whether or not this apparent reality is in some sense a simulation. And this is coming out of not only of neuroscience, but also cosmology, the notion of parallel worlds and simulated worlds created by advanced beings. That was something that you took up in your essay. How seriously do you personally take this possibility that in some sense this world might be a simulation or might be a virtual world?
I guess there's two ways of taking it seriously. One is to think, if it is the case, then what follows? Just as a hypothesis. And two is, though, as an actual thesis that about our world, that maybe it is this way. I don't know. I don't rule out the possibility that we are right now living in a matrix. There's this argument that's been put forward by people like the philosopher Nick Bostrom that goes something like this, to simplify. We should expect that in any universe that contains people as intelligent as us, they're going to create great simulated worlds. Look at our world. Simulation technology is already very good. We've got, Sim Life, Sim City, Sim Earth, The Sims. Pretty soon, give it a couple of decades, there's going to be Sim Universe. We're all going to be running, simulated universes in the background, big 3 universes in the background on my desktop. There's going to be simulated people within them. Then you start to think, okay, well, each of these simulated universes is going to have, hundreds, millions, billions of simulated people, maybe each of them running their own simulations, and so on. And then you start to think, count the numbers. The number of simulated people in the world is going to vastly, vastly outnumber the number of sort of level 0 people in the world. And now there's a question, of course, about whether simulated people will in fact have their own consciousness and their own experience. And that's one place you might block this consideration.
Back to the solipsism. Back to the solipsism problem.
We're right back there. But some people, including me, think there's good reason to believe that even simulated people, silicon brains, so to speak, could have consciousness. Let's just run with that for a second. Then you say, what are the odds right now in this world that probably has vastly more simulated people than real people, that I'm one of the lucky ones at level 0? You might think it's 1 billion to 1 against. So that's an argument that we should actually believe that we are simulated, because there are so many more people like that having experiences just like we are than there are sort of level 0 ground floor people. Now, I don't know if this argument is right. There's various places you might question it, but I take it seriously enough to think that it's not out of the question that I would give it at least 20. If you made me a bet, and God could settle it next week, I'd give at least 20% odds that I'm in a simulation right now.
It was stuff like this that actually drew me into science writing in the first place. Because it seemed to me that science had the possibility of resolving some of the kinds of questions that you get into in your sophomore year of college when you're smoking dope and drinking wine in the middle of the night when you're with your friends. I've, just recently, I guess because, I don't know what it is. I'm getting old. I have children. I have a really different reaction to the sorts of theories that suggest that somehow this reality is it's a simulation, or it's not as real as we think it is. It seems it's too escapist. It's too adolescent. It's too. There is some serious stuff happening in the world. There are very big, real problems that we are trying to deal with. And the idea, I heard Paul Davies, the great Australian physicist. I think he's Australian, isn't he?
He's British originally. He spent a long time in Australia. Now he's back in the
okay.
US.
Well, I heard him give a talk on this a couple of years ago, and he mentioned Nick Bostrom and sort of went through the scenario that you just did to try to persuade us that maybe, odds are pretty good that we live in a simulation. And the idea of smart people dwelling on this possibility, I guess it bothers me now. So I have a sort of a moral rather than intellectual reaction to it. It also comes from the fact that my last book, Rational Mysticism, I got into Hinduism and Buddhism and some of these kind of, mystical philosophies. And of course, as you know, there's some variants of Buddhism and Hinduism that say that this is an illusion. This is Maya, and that when you truly understand reality, you recognize the illusory nature of even yourself and of all other beings, and the illusory nature even of suffering. And I think one of the consequences of seeing life in this way is that you can become a nihilist. And I think this view, I think there's some gurus who actually completely buy into this view of the world, and as a result they become sociopaths who don't give a damn about other people because they don't even think that they don't recognize the reality of the pain and suffering of other people, and so they can behave very callously toward other people. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a reasonable reaction. I don't think this reaction, though, is forced on you simply by entertaining the idea that we're in a simulation. You need to go a lot further down the path to everything is an illusion, nothing exists, nothing is real. So I would like to get off the boat before that point. Just say we do live in a simulated world. Does this mean that somehow our life is meaningless, that nothing is real, and so on? I want to say no. Even if we are in a simulated world, it's still a real world. That's just the nature of our world. We're still interacting with other people, real thoughts, real feelings, real consciousness. We're still living meaningful lives. Indeed, the questions about the external world. Is there really a table out there? Is there really when I shake someone's hand, is there really a hand I'm shaking? I'd like to say that in a simulated world, these are real objects we're interacting with. They're computational to be sure, but that doesn't make them any less real than in the world that, as characterized by current science, where it's quantum mechanical. It's a bit insubstantial, but maybe quantum mechanics is insubstantial. Quantum mechanics didn't suddenly make our lives meaningless. So I think just say we came to believe that we were living in a computer simulation. I don't think we should then decide that, our lives are meaningless, that nothing matters, that nothing is real. We should say this is the world that we're in, and that, we're still going to have to come to grips with it, and to come to grips with all its problems in the same way that, physics, the massive changes in contemporary physics, relativity, quantum mechanics, string theory, none of that has led anyone down the garden path to saying, well, has led most of us down the garden path to, ignoring the world's problems. So I think, you can take on board these speculations about the fundamental metaphysics of the world, while thinking at the level of the manifest image, what's all around us, this is still perfectly real and perfectly meaningful. And that's one of the morals that I think that's in the background of this paper I wrote on the matrix, which is, even if we are in a matrix, everything is still perfectly real.
Right, and in other words, there are still moral consequences to what we do. And
Yeah.
I guess the big question is whether even if this is a simulation, I certainly my emotions are real to me. I assume yours are to you. Therefore, we still have the responsibility to worry about the feelings of other people, whether or not this was created by evil aliens in a 10-dimensional hyperspace squirting off this universe.
I mean, just say we forget the simulation idea and we decide that our universe was created by a god, just like this. Does that change things? Just say we decide that it was created by the devil. Boy, well, that's a bit weird, but does that suddenly absolve all of our actions of any moral importance or consequences? I don't think so. So the mere fact that our world is created is not isn't itself something that sort of negates the meaningfulness of our existence. And I'd say the same for the question of whether our world is ultimately computational, or quantum mechanical. And the simulation idea, I take it as just another version of that Wheeler idea that underneath physics is computation and information. That's the information in the simulation. That's not an idea I think that we should regard as robbing our world of meaning, of consciousness, of morality. I mean, my own view, I guess, about morality is that all morality is grounded in consciousness. And consciousness, experience is itself the thing that makes us subjects of moral worth and moral evaluation. You shouldn't hurt someone because they're a conscious being. As long as in our multi-vat matrix, so to speak, there are other conscious beings out there that we're interacting with, then they're subjects of moral concern, I think, in the same way that we would be in a non-matrix world.
As long as we're getting further and further out in the fringe here, I'll bring up another issue that I got into a little bit for this last book. So I was talking to people who were experts on mystical experience, which sort of sounds like an oxymoron, but there are people who put themselves forward as mystical experts, and most of them have a scholarly perspective on mysticism, the history of mysticism, comparative mysticism, and they also have mystical experiences themselves that they've gotten through meditation or yoga or psychedelic drugs or all of the above. And there was a philosopher I met, I think he teaches now at Fordham, named Robert Foreman, who believed in, he wrote a book called The Problem of Pure Consciousness.
Yep.
And so he said that there are certain mystical states that I think conventionally in philosophy, consciousness is always supposed to be about something. So there is always an object of consciousness. And the idea of sort of pure consciousness doesn't make any sense. But Foreman said that there are certain mystical states when you experience pure consciousness. You are not conscious of anything, and yet you are still conscious. And you can't understand this experience unless you've had it. And even when you've had it, when you come out of it, it's basically impossible to express in words. It's ineffable. Have you encountered that notion before, or have you had such an experience?
I've certainly encountered the notion, and unfortunately, I've never had the experience myself. I mean, boy, what a interesting thing to go through. I take it you have to go through years of training and in being enlightened, in meditation, and maybe when you achieve the moment of enlightenment, you get to have this experience or something. I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether this experience is coherent and it makes sense. Of course, a lot of people are suspicious because it's only reported by people who've been through these very long processes of training. And there's also a question about whether it even makes sense to think about consciousness without content. If you think about consciousness as about the way things feel, then you might think, okay, it's got to feel a certain way, even to have this experience. Even if it's an experience of the void, so to speak, of pure emptiness, isn't that itself a kind of content, a kind of feeling? So there's a lot of debates about how to make sense of this, but the people who believe in it, they think it's the purest form of consciousness, because all of our normal consciousness is corrupted by this content, the real world, colors, red, blues, yellows, feelings, and so on. There's consciousness and there's the content. So this is like getting rid of the contents, but still having the background state of consciousness. I think of that as like the blank screen on which normally the contents of consciousness are projected. So Foreman, I think, himself suggested we should view this as the most primitive form of consciousness. He called it the E. coli of consciousness studies. Start with the simple one, then move up to the complicated one. Unfortunately,
so you've actually talked about this with him.
He came to the Tucson conference actually in '96, the second one. I mean, after that first conference we talked about, these have gone on every couple of years, and he came to the one 2 years later and gave a talk on this, and then we had a debate at another later conference between an Eastern scholar who talked about the role this plays in the Buddhist tradition, and an analytic philosopher who said, no, look, this idea doesn't make any sense, and they had it out. And I think of course the problem wasn't settled at the end of the session, but it's a legitimate question in both the philosophy and the science of consciousness. What are the possible forms that consciousness can take? This is a very strange and bizarre form, but if it really can exist in the way these guys characterize it, then that's something that's worth knowing about. After I published a book on consciousness, somebody criticized me for not trying or at least reporting enough psychedelic experiences. Like, if you're a philosopher of consciousness, you need to be taking drugs, you need to be meditating, just to expand your range of possible experiences that you know about. Otherwise, you're theorizing with insufficient data. So you might think these guys are the mystics. Well, they just have more data than we do.
Well, so are you taking this person's advice and seeking out these sorts of exotic experiences?
Where I can, within limits. Probably I could probably be doing a lot more, but there's only so much time in the world.
Well, and plus there's the problem of getting a grant agency to fund you for these sorts of things. But as a piece of encouragement, a few years back I did an article on the use of peyote by members of the Native American Church for Discover magazine, which was owned by Disney Corporation at the time. And so basically Disney Corporation paid me to go into the desert of Arizona and sit in a teepee and take peyote.
Okay, and you were enlightened?
Actually, it was, we didn't take it until about 10 o'clock at night, and we were sitting on this really hard, packed dirt ground, and it was freezing cold, and you weren't allowed to lie down or even slouch all night. So I had such severe back pain, and plus I was with all these strange Indians, and I was assuming that these were Navajo, and I was assuming that they were having hallucinations of all the horrors that the white men had brought down on them over the past couple hundred years. And so it wasn't the best circumstance for having an enlightenment experience.
So you
but
must
it was
have got
certainly
paranoia
interesting.
then. Yeah. There is this institute in Zurich. It turns out it's almost impossible to do systematic scientific experiments on hallucinogens, at least in human agents in the U.S. and most of the West. But in maybe in Austria and Switzerland, the laws are a bit more relaxed. So in Zurich, there's an institute for studying the effect on hallucinogens, and people can sign up for studies where they'll take various psychedelic drugs and report the experiences. These guys, I guess, have systematized, different kinds of altered states you get from these things on 3 basic dimensions. There's, I can't remember what their names are. There's boundless oceanic openness to the world. That's one of the dimensions, and transcendental loss of ego is another. And this is their systematic scientific study of these experiences. At the same time, there have been people studying the effects of these drugs on various receptors in the brain, just by not doing these on people, but doing the experiments in test tubes. And people have been trying to correlate the different effects of these drugs on the brain with these different patterns of reported experiences you get from these drugs in humans. And you can think of that as another part of the study of the neural correlate of consciousness. So far, I think nobody's got to the neural correlate of enlightenment, but maybe that's coming.
Well, actually, I've been to that center in Zurich. It's a guy named Franz Vollenweider.
Yeah.
I met him at then I went to a conference in Basel, Switzerland. This was about 8 years ago, and Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, was there as this sort of inspirational figure for all these young researchers who are trying to revive the study of psychedelics. So it's happening over there. It's also happening over here. There's a guy at Harvard named John Halpern who's doing studies of psychedelics now. So it's
in humans?
Yes, in humans. He's
okay.
Just starting to try for more for therapeutic purposes than clinical purposes than for studying consciousness, but I think the study of consciousness can't be far behind. I would hope that by studying some of these exotic states, we might be able to get insight into how ordinary consciousness works.
I think that makes sense. There's already been a big tradition of studying, disorders of consciousness in, say, schizophrenia or various, loss of things like face recognition or vision and so on. And in these cases, we found all the time that studying disorders and breakdowns of consciousness gives us insights into normal states of consciousness. So you would think exactly the same from expanding the states of, variations in possible states of consciousness is going to give us more insight into the basic state and the space of possible states. And it's just unfortunate that we as human beings are limited in the space of possible experiences we can have. But think of what bats have, or what Martians might have, and so on. But nonetheless, you might think at least we need to make the most of the set of experiences that we do have. And this is precisely the kind of work that would need to be done in order to study that range of states.
Absolutely. Well, doing my last book gave me an excuse to revisit some of those experiences from my youth. So, I think this is still a tremendously exciting time for people who are studying consciousness, because there's so many different ways that you can approach it, philosophically and scientifically.
We ought to get you back to this conference in Arizona. It keeps happening every 2 years. It's on to about the 8th one next year. You ought to come back and see what's been going on lately.
Absolutely. I've been trying to get back ever since that first one, because I know it's a ball out there, and it gets bigger and bigger every year, and everybody who's anybody goes there. So maybe we can meet up there next spring.
That'd be fantastic.
Hey, so we've already, we've been talking for more than an hour, so covered a lot of ground. I've really enjoyed this, David.
Me too. It's really good to talk to you.
Yeah, so, all right, why don't we sign off now, and I will see you next spring in Tucson.
Fantastic. Look forward to it.
All right, take it easy.
Okay.